Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. We'll give folks a few minutes to get in, get settled, and then we will get started. All right. All right. Well, let folks roll in as they do. But welcome, everyone, today. My name is Jayla Burton. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Programs here at Weaving Voices for Health and Justice. And I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to have today about the hidden toxics in cosmetics, Lilial and fragrance. At Weaving Voices, we work at the intersect of environmental health and justice and focusing on how everyday products, especially those that are harmful to our bodies, can impact our health and communities. So today's conversation will be a really important piece of that work. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Before we dive in, I realize that Teams webinar might be a new thing for many of us here. I know we're usually used to Zoom, but I do want to encourage folks to utilize the chat and go ahead and introduce yourselves, name, pronouns, where you're calling in from, and then if you are affiliated with any organization, we would love to know who's in the room today. Some other things to keep in mind. The chat will be primarily used if you have any resources that you'd like to share, sentiments, reactions, things of that sort. If there are any questions, we do ask for folks to add those into the Q&A box, and there will be a special time at the end where we will have an opportunity to answer any of those questions. Also, if you would like to have captions on, all you need to do is go to, in the top bar, there should be a little 3 dots, and you can go ahead to the language and speech category and then select show live captions. And that'll ensure that you have the caption setting here with us today. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So Weaving Voices for Health and Justice was originally founded in 1995 as Women's Voices for the Earth. So while we have rebranded, our mission remains the same. And welcome to those who are just coming to know us as Weaving Voices, and hello to everyone that has known us throughout the 30 years of our work. So I will go ahead and go to the next slide. We are a national organization that is based out of Denver, Colorado, and want to also acknowledge that we operate on land unjustly taken from Indigenous tribal nations that we refer to as the Nche, Shoshone, Apache, Cheyenne, and Arapaho lands. I am technically right now calling in from Oakland, California on Ohlone land, and we also encourage folks to share where you're calling in from in the chat also. We can go ahead. Thank you. So our speakers today are going to be Alex Scranton, Weave's Director of Science and Research, and we'll be joined by Swati Ryasam, who is our Cosmetic Safety and Research Fellow and has been working with Weave since, I want to say, August on specifically a project around Lilial, but has background as a community organizer, has previously worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, and has done a lot of movement and environmental health and justice work throughout her career as well, and is currently a PhD candidate up in Washington. So without further ado, I will go ahead and, oh, we have an agenda. Okay, everyone. So the background, what we'll be learning today is talking about our background on fragrances and all the work that Weave has done up until this point. And we will also be diving into specifically what is going on with Lilial, the science behind it, what the health impacts are, and where can you find it in your products. We'll also be covering some policy related issues as well in terms of what is the current state of regulation and where are there currently gaps, and then making recommendations for how we move forward with this chemical of concern. So without further ado, I will pass it to Alex, who will share a little bit more about what Lilial is and all the science behind it.
Thank you so much, Jayla. And yeah, welcome everybody. It's so exciting to see all the names pop up in the chat. Good to see people from here all around the country, which is exciting. So I'll talk a little bit about fragrance to begin with and why we do fragrance work here at Weave. We've been doing fragrance work for decades, basically because fragrance exposure is ubiquitous, right? We work on a lot of different consumer product sectors, and fragrance is found in all of them. So we work on cosmetics and cleaning products and menstrual products and intimate care. You find scented products in all of these, you know. And so just wanted to specify that when we talk fragrance, we're not just talking perfumes and colognes, because that's kind of what people often think of, but any sort of scented product, intentionally scented for marketing reasons. So most of the time, while we find fragrance everywhere, most of the time what manufacturers will do is just tell you that their product contains fragrance, right? They don't tell you what's in that fragrance. That fragrance it can stand for anywhere 10 to 100 different mystery chemicals in that one, fragrance term. We do know that some of those chemicals that can be used in fragrance are known to be very toxic. There are carcinogens, there are reproductive toxicants, there are neurotoxicants that affect your brain, there's loads of skin allergens that can affect your skin, and more. So we know there are a number of chemicals we never know or rarely know when they're in the fragrances we're exposed to, but we know some of them are very toxic. The vast majority of the other fragrance chemicals, and there's somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 chemicals used in fragrance, they're largely under-researched. There is, very little data available, safety data available on a lot of them. Most of it's done by the fragrance industry themselves. A lot of that is kept confidential. We also know that there are a lot of people that report harm from being exposed to fragrance. So we have people who are affected by fragrance in the way of getting migraines or headaches, lots of people getting skin rashes, dermatitis from fragrance exposure. There's reports of respiratory harm, whether that's asthma or breathing problems. So we really feel that there needs to be a lot more sort of sunshine in the world of fragrance, right? We need more disclosure, more transparency in the industry to know what we're being exposed to and what that exposure really means for our health. And so we've done a lot of work in the last, decade or so, really towards increasing fragrance ingredient disclosure, getting manufacturers to tell you what fragrance ingredients they're using in the products that we use, so that we know better what we're exposed to, and then we can better protect our own health from those exposures. All right, let's go to the next slide. So today we're going to focus on Lilial. I know there's some questions that sort of came in with the registrations, like, what is Lilial? What is Lilial, and why Lilial, right? Lilial is a specific example. It's you might have seen it sometimes on labels as butyl phenylmethylpropanol, which is a much less friendly chemical name to talk about. I'll refer to it as Lilial because it's a lot easier. It is a fragrance ingredient. It is a synthetic fragrance ingredient. You do not find this chemical in nature. It is a chemical that was first developed in the 1950s. It's pretty cheap to make. It blends really well with other fragrance ingredients. And then most important to the industry, it smells great. It smells like lily of the valley, those flowers, which is a very, popular scent that people like. Turns out that the lily of the valley flower, it's very difficult to extract the scent naturally from that flower. It kind of falls apart, right? So it really took until the 1950s. It was a real coup for the fragrance industry when they figured out how to synthetically create this lily of the valley scent. And it was a fragrance house called Givaudan that figured it out in the 1950s. Once they figured it out, they patented it. It was an immediate bestseller because, again, it was cheap. It was easily to blend well. It smelled great. People liked the scent. It got used in lots and lots of products. Okay, let's go to the next. Okay. So where do you find Lilial these days? Based on what we know, cosmetics-wise, hair care products tend to be scented with Lilial. Lotions and skincare products tend to be scented with Lilial. And also there are certainly a large number of perfume and colognes, kind of fine perfumes that contain Lilial. But it's not just cosmetics. We're finding it in cleaning products. You can find it in almost any fragranced product. I have on the slide, particularly things listed as having floral or lily fragrances. It's a little bit misleading to say that because I've also seen Lilial in products that are scented as orange, as lemongrass, as vanilla, as rosewood. I mean, because it gets blended into a lot of things. So it's not exclusively those kind of floral or lily fragrances. And then, like I said, it's listed by a number of different names in different contexts. On cosmetic products, you'll usually see, if it's there at all, butyl phenyl methyl propionyl. This is what's called the INCI name. Now, the INCI is the International Nomenclature of Cosmetic Ingredients. So it's the terminology that the cosmetics ingredients uses when they have cosmetic ingredients. So that's the one you're most likely to see on the label, but it's also referred to as Lilial, which is a trade name, and then these other terms as well in a couple studies and that kind of thing. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I really want to dive into the safety of Lilial. And again, because Lilial is just sort of this poster child for the fragrance industry in terms of how fragrance is often created and the sort of the lack of kind of safety measures that are taken. So it's created, as I said, in the 1950s. As far as we know, there weren't safety studies conducted when it was first created. This is fairly standard procedure in the 1950s. They weren't too concerned about chemicals like fragrance causing harm. So certainly nothing was published at the time that we know about Lilial. Fast forward 40 years of use later, and Givaudan, the company that was first invented it, they actually start doing some reproductive toxicity studies on rats using Lilial. The rats receiving the highest levels of Lilial, they found severe degeneration of testicles in the male rats and near total sperm damage, like just zero motility of sperm exposed to Lilial. Major red flag, right, to get these kind of results from a product that you're using regularly. Now, they did not publish any of this research. They kept it confidential. According to the Toxic Substances Control Act, they were required to send this data to the EPA. They asked the EPA to also keep this research confidential, assuring them that, while yes, bad for rats, the impacts to humans would be negligible. They gave no rationale for how they understood that to be the case, but that's what they said, and the EPA took that, and they kept this research confidential. So in the 1990s, nobody but the EPA and this one company, Givaudan, knows of these results. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so part two, so this is now 18 years later, in 2008, a company called BASF, they're also a chemical manufacturer, they make a lot of fragrances, they are now also making Lilial and investing in making and selling Lilial. They find out kind of about the studies that were done by Givaudan in the 1990s. They decide to replicate them to see if they're really true. They find exactly the same thing: severe degeneration of testicles in the rats, near total sperm damage. They also tested on female rats, and they find major pregnancy problems. Basically, none of the rats that they were testing were able to successfully reproduce, either not being able to get pregnant or having stillbirth pups. So again, I've got two red flags. I mean, it's like these are really, really bad signs for a chemical that is being widely used. They decide to do the same thing that Givaudan did. They submit the data to the EPA as required by the law. They ask them to keep it confidential. They don't publish any of this publicly in a journal, and they conclude that the impacts to humans would also be negligible based on no given rationale for that information. Okay, next slide. Okay. So now we move forward and to sort of more recent days of what we know on Lilial. So there starts to be a little bit of attention to this. In 2009, under the Obama administration, the EPA starts looking at all of this data that they've gotten through the Toxic Substances Control Act, and it's been marked confidential, and they rethink some of it. They start declassifying it, saying, this is actually important research. This isn't confidential for any reason. We're going to declassify it, make it non-confidential. Some of the first studies they declassified were, in fact, these studies on Lilial. That's the first place I saw it. I was highly alarmed in 2009 to see these results. I'd been working on research on fragrance for a while. I'd never heard of this chemical before. I'd never heard anyone talking about this chemical before. But it seemed, the red flags were going off. It seemed, quite dangerous. Again, a number of years later, there's been a little bit more research out there. In 2016, the European Union, they have a body called the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety. We have no sort of comparable independent, scientific research body here in the US, but they have one in the European Union. And the government's asked this committee to take a look at the science on Lilial and issue an opinion. Is it safe to be using Lilial in consumer products? Spoiler alert, they basically say no. They have no assurance based on the minimal data that they have that they can say that this is safe in Lilial in consumer products. Of course, it is still widely used and has been, for 75 years. In 2016, the German government also gets very interested in Lilial because they want to know if Lilial is actually found in people's bodies. Like, we know it's in products, like, is it showing up in our bodies? Well, it turns out there's no methodology that's ever been published or created to figure out how you detect Lilial in humans. So they figure it out. They get their scientists on it, like, find out how you can figure this out. They figure out what the metabolites are. They find you can detect it in urine. And they published a paper in 2016 saying, here's how you do it. If you want to know if there's Lilial, in the human body, this is the methodology for doing that. They incorporate Lilial into their biomonitoring program, which is a program where they test thousands of German citizens for all kinds of chemicals, just in their blood, in their urine, just to see what people are exposed to. So they're the first country to actually look at Lilial in biomonitoring. They test thousands of people. They find in their paper they published in 2020, they find Lilial in 99 to 100% of the samples. I mean, everybody has got some level of Lilial in their body. This is the first time anyone knows this, how widely exposed we are to this chemical. And of course, we still have this rat data from, back from the 1990s saying this is a real, red flag reproductive toxin. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so that sort of begs the question, how big a problem is Lilial exposure? We know it's in all of us. We know it's doing terrible things to rats. The reality is we still don't really know how bad it is in humans. There is very, very little research, almost no research on what Lilial exposure does to humans. Now, there was one study that I found last year, it was published in 2025, and it was looking at a number of different chemicals, but it found children who lived in homes where they used laundry detergent that contained Lilial, they were more likely to have sort of breathing problems or being diagnosed with wheeze than homes where they use laundry detergent that didn't have Lilial. So this is a respiratory impact. No one's seen this before. Again, it's concerning because, of course, we're all exposed to Lilial. But of course, my huge concern with Lilial, as it's been since 2009, is what is it doing to human fertility? What is it doing to human pregnancy outcomes? No one has done this research. Now, you can't intentionally expose people to a dangerous substance and then see what it does. But in this case, you can do epidemiological studies, right? You can look at, because people are already exposing themselves to Lilial, look at the people who have high levels of Lilial in their bodies compared to people with low levels of Lilial in their bodies. Is one group having more pregnancy problems than the other? Is one group having more difficulty getting pregnant? These are studies that can be done. These are studies that should have been done a long time ago by the industry, but they instead chose to basically stick their head in the sand. They had all the red flags from the rat data, and they decided to conclude it was going to be fine in humans without finding out. So we still basically don't know. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this brings me back to, we really need this precautionary approach to fragrance. We are literally decades overdue on doing something about Lilial because, it was known, even though it was kept secret, it was known that, this is a harmful chemical. There are untold health consequences in humans over these decades. Now, I would love to be wrong, right? I would love for the research to be done and find out that actually Lilial hasn't harmed anybody. It's a possibility. I think it's pretty unlikely. And we have to remember that we're talking about fragrance, right? This is a purely aesthetic feature to a product. It's never necessary. It's never essential, right? It's really unacceptable for manufacturers to pose any risk to our health for the sake of making something smell nice, right? We can and should be using safer alternatives. Perfectly good safer alternative is fragrance-free. We do not need to scent nearly as many of things as we scent in our world today. It's just, it's not worth the risk of a potential reproductive toxicant in something just to make it smell nice. Anyway, so that's a little bit of me on my fragrance soapbox. But I will now turn it over to Swati, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about what's being done about Lilial today. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And hi, everybody. It's so great to see so many folks. It's great to see a lot of familiar names. It's like great to see a lot of new names. So thank you so much for joining in the middle of your Thursday. As Jayla kind of introduced me, I'm Swati Rice. I'm the Cosmetic Safety Research Fellow, and I'm going to be kind of driving you through a little bit of the current regulation as well as the current campaign that we've has that I have been working on kind of throughout the length of my fellowship up until now, or short title, what have regulators done to mitigate Lilial's potentially harmful effects and what is Weave doing about it? So we'll move to the next slide. Thanks so much, Drea. So the short answer is not a ton. Regulatory activity around fragrances in general and Lilial in particular is pretty new. But I'm going to walk you through a little bit of why. Because primarily a lot of Weave's work is focused on the US context, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on an international context and then really bring us back to the US context. But in the United States, fragrance and flavor ingredients are uniquely exempt from a lot of the disclosure or labeling laws that other chemical ingredients are kind of beholden to. And as a result, allergens in these mixtures that are used then in products are rarely disclosed. They're rarely disclosed on packaging that is in general outside of explicit legal requirements, as I've like bolded and starred here. And that is in particular in response to the international regulations that I'll get on in a little bit. But also, of course, as a result of current, fairly new within the last couple of years, national level regulations. And I see a bunch of folks from the Safe Cosmetics program here. So hello, good to see you. And so, with regard to the explicit legal requirement, California in 2020 passed the Fragrance and Flavor Ingredient Right to Know Act. Right to Know is a very common phrase for disclosure laws or disclosure regulatory activity. In 2020, it was SB 312, and this requires companies selling cosmetics in the state of California to report the presence of any fragrance or flavor ingredient that appears on one or more of these kind of 23 hazard lists referenced in that law specifically to the Safe Cosmetics program. And so really, even though there is a disclosure law, it's really important to kind of bank that a lot of these laws are not necessarily comprehensive, and that really the people who retain the most amount of information about a fragrance or about any kind of health impact of a fragrance or flavor is usually the industry. And I think that that is kind of a little bit at the intersection of what Weave's work is at. And so we'll move to the next slide. Talking a little bit about just the international context for a little bit. So in 2022, the EU banned the use of Lilial in cosmetics and cleaning products under their Cosmetic Products Regulations, CPR number 1223/2009. This effectively bans Lilial as of March 1st, 2022. Just an important kind of side note, as a result of Brexit, Great Britain is no longer in the EU. And so despite that, they had been involved in kind of the regulatory process up until then, and they followed closely with a ban effective December 5th, so just later that year. And the justification is that Lilial got classified under this umbrella term of carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reprotoxic substances. And the specific justification for Lilial was on reprotoxicity as shown by animal studies. So, as Alex kind of identified in her set of slides, there are limited human studies available specifically around Lilial. And, of course, as part of what scientific regulators do is often look at the breadth of toxicity studies around human, animal, and environmental toxicity. And very particularly on the animal studies thing, it just kind of occurred to me as Alex was talking, of course. But for those who know, Vince Cogliano actually has like a very phenomenal slide and presentation on the regulatory delays between, in particular, things that are found carcinogenic in animal studies and how much time delay it takes for them to be found carcinogenic in epidemiological studies and thusly regulated. The answer is usually it takes quite a bit of time. I think the longest I saw was 30 odd years. But that's just something important to kind of note as we think about regulations that are on the basis of animal toxicity. And we'll move to the next slide. So kind of in the national context, of course, I talked about the right to know kind of disclosure regulation that underpins a lot of the logistical work that I've been doing as a part of this fellowship. But of course, California in 2025 started enforcing the Toxic Free Cosmetics Act, or AB 2762. The Toxic Free Cosmetic Act is, of course, one of the most stringent state-level bans on cosmetic ingredients in the United States. It incorporates 24 chemicals, from the EU 2022 regulation, so you can watch kind of national or state level regulation, try to follow closely on the international context. And this is kind of to prevent this constant patchworking issue we have. Sorry, I'm like trying to prevent my cat from being in the screen as well with us. But of course, the 2022 EU regulation includes, formaldehyde and mercury, very high chemicals of interest, all PFAS as a result of an amendment that was written on to this California regulation. And of course, Lilial, which is a part of this Assembly Bill expansion of chemicals. And so, as a result, in the state of California, which I used to be a resident of, and I am no longer a resident of, Lilial will be banned from cosmetics effective January 1st, 2027. And I think that there had been kind of on the national level beyond California, there have been several attempts at ingredient disclosure acts for fragrances or at safer beauty bill packages that have not really gone forward besides or beyond introduction. That work is still active, and Weave is a part of those coalitions. And so I will just move us to the next slide. So kind of moving a little bit more specifically into the work that I've been doing in this fellowship, broadly under cosmetic corporate accountability, I have been really taking advantage of all the hard work that folks at the Safe Cosmetics program and that California has done as a result of this right to know law, to just look in the California Safe Cosmetics database. So, considering the existing regulation in the EU and the upcoming kind of signal posting regulation that's going to take effect in California, Weave has been compiling a list of companies. I've been compiling a list of companies that continue to manufacture products, primarily cosmetics, that contain Lilial as reported to the Safe Cosmetics database. And so this is just a screenshot of the database. Jay, let's put a link in the chat, a corrected link. Thank you so much for that. The database is very large. I do not recommend downloading the whole database because it will take quite a bit of time. But that being said, it is like fairly simple to navigate either by the ingredient that you are looking for, in which, as Alex kind of identified, Lilial comes under several chemical names. You could put in any of those names, and theoretically, it would be able to kind of bring you right back to the chemical that you're looking for. And a really important caveat here is that you can find a lot of information about these chemicals, but very specifically, you can only find information to the extent that companies have made the choice to report that information or to find that information relevant and report it to California regulators. And so within the database, contingent on company reporting, you can find simple things such as the product ID, you can find the company or manufacturer, you can find the brand name, you can find variants, which is kind of identifying what scents usually that for our particular interest Lilial is in. You can find when the product was discontinued, if it has been discontinued, or when the ingredient might have been removed, which for the purposes of our work around Lilial, we see a lot of product not discontinued, but ingredient removed. And then you can also find the concentration, which I think is particularly interesting, with a very big asterisk that concentration is often listed as a trade secret. And so you can find it conceptually, but it is often listed as a trade secret. But it is sometimes listed in a number, and that I find particularly helpful for disclosure. And so, yeah, just a quick cutout of how you can find that. But yeah, go ahead, Drea. Thank you. So yeah, what did we find in the database? So I conducted our initial search in September of 2025. I conducted kind of a separate search in February just to do a little bit of cleanup. But what we found in September was that there were over 1,500 products sold in the state of California and presumably across the entire United States that reported the continued use of Lilial in those products. And while a few companies have begun the removal of this chemical in their products or discontinued those products wholesale, many companies, the vast majority of companies, have not. And even fewer companies have even completely removed Lilial from all of their products. And as Alex kind of said, many of these companies manufacture a variety of cosmetic products, from hair lotions to skincare products to perfumes. And so it is just kind of a little bit of like a patchwork removal process that we're finding in the database. And if you move on to the next slide, you'll be able to see kind of a graphical image of, I think what Alex termed recently kind of a NASCAR logo graphical image of companies that we suspect are still using Lilial as reported by the database, which really, really important contingency is that the public only has the information that the state regulator necessarily has and can make public. And so these are companies that we suspect are still using Lilial as a result of their reporting to the California Safe Cosmetics database. On the left here, you can see companies that have removed Lilial from all of their products that are reported in the database. It is significantly fewer companies than the number of companies on the right. But within that, you can see some fairly huge brand names, right? You have Colgate Palmolive, which, for a company that makes a lot of, products that are used by people of a variety of classes or people of a variety of income brackets, them just going ahead and removing Lilial is actually pretty phenomenal. And then, of course, you have Lush, you have a medical product manufacturer, which is always nice to see. We don't really need a lot of fragrances in the medical, kind of context. And then, some very popular brands like Cosrx. Then on the right, you can kind of see everybody else who continues to use Lilial in some of their products. And so very specifically what is not here and what would be like an absolute kind of like brain melt to visualize is the number of companies that have chosen not to do anything around it. But within the companies that are partially removing Lilial, which means they have removed it from at least one of the products that they make and perhaps not others, or maybe they've removed it from 16 of their 17 products and we was asking for that last one. We can see a lot of companies that are very familiar. CVS brand jumps out immediately, Victoria's Secret, of course, and then there's also Summer's Eve, which is kind of notable, at least for Weave. Weave has an ongoing campaign around Summer's Eve called Summer's Deceive, which I think Jayla is about to drop in the chat. So please check that out. There's been a lot of work that Weave has been engaging in and around Summer's Eve and their activities. And a very important note is that these brands, this kind of list of brands that we suspect are still using Lilial is relevant as of April 9th, 2026. So if they have reported after that, I do not have that on the slide. So we'll move to the next slide and just do some kind of overall takeaways. There are several companies with partial or absolutely no removal of Lilial that also manufacture products in the EU. And what's really important here is that if the EU as of March 1st, 2022, or Great Britain as a result of December 2022, have required these companies to remove Lilial from their products, but they continue to manufacture and distribute products in the United States as a result of regulations not necessarily doing that. That creates kind of this, it creates disparate health outcomes as a result of people's regulatory context. And it indicates to perhaps you, and certainly to me, that companies really only minimally are complying with health and safety regulations. They're trying to do kind of what Alex was identifying, right? They say, oh, well, it's toxic in animal studies, but we don't really have to worry about humans, or, oh, it's regulated in the EU, but we don't have to regulate it in the United States. David G., for those of you who know, have like a very funny quote I heard like several years ago about, oh, well, gravity doesn't work the same. Toxics, don't work the same between the United States and Europe. So obviously the regulations have to be different. But really what it identifies is that companies are willingly allowing products that have been regulated for health and safety reasons to continue potentially harming communities in context as a result of their desire to continue manufacturing those products. And so while I'm very excited about the California regulation, especially because the California regulation represents like a huge part of the national market share, there are some prevailing concerns about the fact that California will do the regulation and we will just ship all of the products that have Lilial that aren't necessarily regulated by California to North Carolina, because North Carolina doesn't have that regulation and they may not for several years. Um, but not to pick on that. That is just my home state. We'll move on to the next slide. And so what is Weave doing about it? What am I doing about it right now? So Weave is directly engaging with companies that have begun partial Lilial removal and calling for an urgent and continued removal, highlighting consumers' health and safety concerns with regard to Lilial and replacement chemicals. We didn't really get necessarily into replacement chemicals, but there's a chemical called nymphiol that has been identified as a Lilial replacement. And as many people know who are in and around the toxic space, we have this kind of chemical whack-a-mole issue where new chemicals are identified. And again, we fail to test them for health and safety concerns before just chucking them into products and deciding that they are fine. And then, of course, highlighting existing regulation that impacts their distribution currently, particularly if they have distribution in the EU, and identifying their stated commitments to environmental and social governance, their commitments to sustainability, their commitments to consumer health concerns and health protection, and the growing number of their direct competitors who have completely phased out Lilial, which I think is particularly notable. I think that lots of companies have concerns about phase out as a result of the financial impacts of making massive product shifts. But to see several companies actually, which have larger distribution platforms, making those product shifts out of a desire to just kind of bite the bullet and do it, knowing that it will come at some point, is notable for these companies to help make decisions. And so we sent out the first batch of letters last week. We will be kind of launching this campaign if we move forward to the next slide. That's fine. Yeah, we sent out a batch of letters. We'll be launching this campaign in the next couple of weeks, so I'm excited for folks to keep tuned. But a lot of this is very overwhelming, right? Like, we're talking about manufacturers who you don't know, maybe, and we're talking about brands who you have kind of this like passing relationship with as a consumer, who theoretically are interested in your perspective, right? So it feels very disempowering often. And when we talk about toxics, it feels really disempowering to think about, oh, like, what's all this stuff that's happening and what can I do about it? So there are some things that you can do to protect yourself and to protect your communities. You can, of course, get educated. Welcome, you're here. You can get educated and learn about the health harms of Lilial, of other fragrance chemicals, how to spot Lilial on ingredient lists, and existing regulations in place to protect our communities and environment. You can get activated and take advantage of the fact that brands are very interested in what their consumers have to say and create a groundswell, right? And call your favorite brands, asking them to disclose all fragrance ingredients and commit to phasing out Lilial in response of the EU ban and ahead of the California ban. You can also let them know that you prefer brands that voluntarily provide 100% ingredient transparency or disclosure, that are usually certified by a third party, because we like to keep things independently assessed. And of course, you can get organized. You can take the information that you learned here today and other information that you might have either from Weave or from Safe Cosmetics or from several other people who have been in this fight around fragrances and around safer cosmetics, and share resources about Lilial and about fragrances with your community and encourage them to reach out to their favorite brands. And, I have this kind of like sub note in here. The easiest thing that you can do immediately at your ability is to just go fragrance free. As Alex kind of identified, fragrances are auxiliary. They provide no functional benefit to a product. They're just aesthetic. It is very hard to get away from fragrances in all things. And there is no universe right now that we live in where you can buy yourself out of exposure. And there are, of course, ethical concerns with that as well. But to the extent that you are able to, the extent that you and your communities are able to, just choose fragrance-free products. Choose products made by companies who have this ingredient disclosure. So moving on to the next slide, how do you find Lilial? Just pinging forward. It exists on ingredient disclosure ingredients list just like this. So if you look on the slide, this is a Jamaican mango and lime product. And I have, Lilial right there. butylphenyl methylpropionol kind of underlined here. Or on the next image, this like Saint-Tropez product we have. Oh, can we move forward, Jerry? There you go. Yeah, on the next image, we have this like kind of Saint-Tropez project. So this is, again, very important. If Lilial is listed by these companies, if they choose to list them on their ingredient list, they will disclose them. It will be under this name, likely. It may be under some names, but it's most likely to be under this name as Alex identified. So that's a little bit of how you can kind of spot it. And then moving on to the next slide, let us know, kind of if you do find Lilial in any of your products, get engaged with us. Email us a photo, front, back, and the ingredients zoomed in, and just tell us where you found it, the city and state in particular. The email is kind of on the slide here. It's weavingvoices@weavingvoices.org for those on the transcript or who can't see the slides. But yeah, just let us know if you find Lilial in particular as we're moving forward on this California regulation. We have, a little under a year before it takes effect. That'll be of particular interest. It's a national regulation that companies will have to respond to. And then moving on to the next slide. As I mentioned, Weave is going to be launching more resources, blogs, fact sheets as a part of this campaign in kind of the coming weeks with calls to our folks in our community, all of you here, to get involved. And so, just kind of keep up with us. You're registered for this webinar. You will get communication from us as a result of this. And I encourage you to kind of stay in touch. And with that, that's kind of the end of my slide section. But yeah, stay connected with us. Particularly, there's a QR code for news and updates. There's a QR code if you want to support us through donations, and follow us on all most major platforms that you're on. And with that, I'll pass back over to Jayla for the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex and Swati, for sharing all of this amazing information. I see a lot of discourse in the chat and some questions. So at this time, I want to encourage people to utilize the Q&A portion of our Teams feature, and we can open it up to ask our presenters anything. I'm going to kick us off with one question that I did see in the chat, and it wasn't specifically around cosmetics, but more so around the issue of Lilial being found in cleaning products that people are heating and warming, and if we are aware of the effects and impacts of that practice. So I don't know if you're able to answer that, Alex, or know anything
Sure.
about that.
Yeah, no, I can take a thing. And I've heard a little bit about this. And again, there's, haven't seen any research on exactly what that does. But with your heating, like obviously, probably liquid cleaning product, anything that is volatile is going to gas off. You're going to breathe in more of it. So, Lilial, other fragrance ingredients are going to be among that for sure. It probably intensifies the smell while you're cleaning it, but that also means you're probably breathing in more. But as far as some, I haven't seen any studies looking at kind of measuring what the increase is compared to just using a product generally. I don't think, I suppose, when you're doing dishes, using hot water, will help with like the cleaning abilities. There's a little bit of heating there, but otherwise, I don't think the rest of cleaning your house, heating a cleaning product is probably negligible in terms of impact for the heating, but certainly will increase your exposure to the chemicals that are in there, particularly fragrance.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. I see there is one question in the Q&A from Natasha. It says, thank you for this conversation beyond advocacy. How are you approaching public education? Are you open to partnering with media platforms to make this information more widely known with impacted communities?
Oh, fantastic question. And thank you. And yes to all of the above. I sort of feel like this is, a bit of like our Lilial coming out party, just like talking about getting kind of Lilial on the radar. It's been, you mentioned in a few of our previous reports we had a report about cleaning products a couple years ago, and we've mentioned it here and there, but this is really the first time we've really focused on it because we know that people don't really know about this issue, but they need to, because it is significant, and there's all this kind of policy, going on and policy that we want to encourage. And I think the more the regular public knows about it, the more likely companies are going to respond to the laws. I mean, one of the trickiest things about even the California ban is that it'll be banned in cosmetics, of course, not banned in other types of products. So companies are fully allowed, even in California, to put it in their cleaning products or whatever. But also because so many companies just say fragrance on the label, if they're not disclosing it, means someone's got to go take it to a lab and test it to see if they're actually not in compliance. So, and there are companies that may not even realize that there's Lilial in the fragrances that they use. So there are certainly enforcement issues going forward, but the more that they hear from their customers saying, I don't want to buy a product that's got Lilial in it, that's really where things tend to move. So.
Great, thank you, Alex. I'm going to move on to the next question from Anna. This says, do you know if the urinary Lilial biomarker is stable over time when stored? Related question, does the biomarker reflect very recent exposure like phthalates, or is it more long-term?
Oh, these are really good, detailed questions. There were 4 different Lilial biomarkers that was in the urine. There was one particularly that they found that was kind of when they found 100%, and then there are other ones that are found at lower percentages. I'd have to read the study again. It seemed to be these 4 seemed to be very clear markers of exposure, but I'm not sure what the how long they're stable over time. I think, as far as whether or not they're transitory, or they haven't done studies looking at whether or not it gets stored in fat or anything like that. They're showing it in urine. I think it's probably more likely reflecting the recent exposure, as far as we know. But of course, because we are all pretty much exposed all of the time,
there's never really a
lifetime.
long-term exposure to isolate necessarily.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're constantly getting, even if it only lasts a couple of days in your body, it's there all the time. Yeah. Oh, can't hear you, Jayla.
Sorry, I was taking notes because I'm also learning a lot here. Vicky asked, do candles have Lilial?
Totally good question. I'm trying to think if there were any. Well, I guess candles wouldn't have been on the cosmetics database because that's cosmetics and candles aren't a cosmetic. I would say very likely. Yeah, because it's a very popular scent and it's the kind of thing that would be in candles, but the disclosure is probably limited.
Yeah, I would say kind of like, while the campaign that we're really focused on is focused on cosmetics, and a lot of the regulations we've kind of cited are focused on cosmetics, the fragrances that we are regulating in cosmetics are fragrances, just general fragrances. And I think that's a little bit to this kind of like weird regulatory landscape that chemicals live in, that's really, identified based on use case. There's a great paper that Rachel Schaefer, who was formerly actually at UW and then at EPA, had around this like regulatory patchwork of like, what kind of chemical or where is your chemical used, and then who becomes responsible for it, and then what kind of different regulation is it under, as if these chemicals may not have the same health effects when considered in different regulatory contexts. And so, yes, if it is fragranced, and it is fragranced in a lily type or citrus type or floral type fragrance, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is one more. I'm going back and forth between the Q&A and the chat. I want to make sure I get everything. But if there's a policy paper to share that can be shown to government agencies about this issue, and I don't believe that's something that we've developed, but I can let Alex and Swati speak a little bit more to
Sure. No, and there are resources currently in development, kind of fact sheets and blogs. This is something certainly that we would love to put together, and it's great that there's a call for it. We are happy to create things. If there's a specific immediate need, please let us know. And we're always happy to put in comments and things if there's policies that of where you think it would be relevant. But that is exactly the kind of thing that we will develop, because there are lots of different audiences that need to know more about this chemical and get it out of our products.
Yeah. There is also one comment kind of separate from that, Jayla, that I saw that Natasha, I think, put in the chat of just recognizing a lot of natural hair care brands in that the natural hair community uses. This is not something that we really touched on a ton in the presentation, but is really worthwhile and something we bring up to companies that, focus their products primarily on natural hair communities or predominantly BIPOC communities, which is that, of course, as a result of, or not as a result of, but fragrances, like many other things, kind of fall in this universe of what's known as like the triple jeopardy of exposure. And so, there are a lot of communities who tend to, people who have lower income brackets who can only afford kind of cheaper products, and a lot of toxics, including a lot of toxic fragrances, get really thrown into that. There are products, of course, that are predominantly targeting women of color, in particular Black women, that are scented. There's a lot of work around Tamara James Todd and Emi Zoda have done a lot of work around beauty justice. Natasha, I also see that you're very into beauty justice. And so there is also, of course, the ongoing kind of disparate chemical exposure that occurs along these lines of social oppression that are very important and that Weave does highlight. And so in particular, where there are companies who are kind of pivoting most of their products or focusing most of their products to communities of color, and not to call it any one particular company for being bad at all, but like Palmer's, for example, is a company that uses Lilial as a fragrance in some of their products. Palmer's has built a very long legacy of commitment in the Black community, as a result of their community activities, as a result of who they're marketing to. And where we reach out to that company, we identify specifically the ways that the population that they are primarily serving and they are primarily interested is adversely affected by this and other kind of products with chemicals like this. So that's just a really important point I wanted to highlight kind of for our other listeners who didn't catch it in the chat.
Thank you so much for adding that. And then I will. Oh,
can I add one other thing? I just thought of that I meant to mention earlier, just in terms of, we've asked people like, contact companies. Swati is doing a great job of contacting a whole lot of companies that are on the list from the database. Just to give you a few examples, like this does work. We started reaching out because we've had this Summer's Eve campaign. They make intimate care products like douches and feminine washes and things. We reached out to them last summer, right? As part of our campaign specifically on their products. One of the things we highlighted was the fact that we saw that they had Lilial in their products. And it was 5 different products that were highlighted in the database that contain Lilial. As of today, sort of looking at the updated database, 2 of those products have been discontinued, and 2 of them have noted that that Lilial has been removed. So they've never contacted us back. They've been very sort of uncommunicative, but they are in fact taking action. So this kind of exposure, getting companies called out and talking to them and telling them that their customers really care, it does make a difference. So I just wanted to
for sure.
Yeah, thank you for flagging that, Alex. And it'll be really interesting to see come the beginning of 2027, when there is the enforcement in the state of California, how everyone falls in line and what is the impact of that. So, but I think there's definitely things we want to prioritize before that time to make sure that not only folks in California are protected, but on a national level as well. Okay, well, I feel like this has been a wonderful conversation, and I definitely want to invite folks to connect with us individually beyond this webinar if this has sparked any areas of a collaboration or support, for sure. I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat a quick evaluation form if you all wouldn't mind filling it out. It really does help us to be able to do these sort of educational webinars in the future. And then in addition to that, I'm just going to share just some other links for those, if this is your first time interfacing with Weave, how to stay in the loop with all of the things that we have coming down the pipeline, and within that, maybe even sharing some exciting news on the responses that we get from the companies that we are reaching out to. So thank you everyone for joining today and taking time out of your Thursday. And yeah, let us know what you all need, and appreciate everyone for being in this space today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks folks. Have a great day.